talk about one of my favorite subjects, which is the art of building and creating impactful products. And for me, this really starts with kind of larger than life ideas, and really, really kind of big concepts and where we headed and big kind of dream moments. But it needs to start somewhere, like pitching a tent to stargaze. Practically speaking, though, for me, it's about three things. Like, how do we build and create impactful products? And the first thing for me is about worthwhileness. How do I gauge what's worthwhile in a world where we have lots of different things that we could be working on, lots of different priorities, lots of different competing concepts and ideas? How do I gauge which one's the most worthwhile to be working on? Second thing is about being innovative. When I say innovative, I think this is like a non-term in many respects, as in everybody calls everything innovative. And for me, being innovative is about thinking a little bit differently. And then the final thing for me is it nuanced? Or what about the product is nuanced? How do I think about the tiny and the small things? Or in other words, win. So really easy to remember acronyms, and particularly winning ones, right? So when I think about worthwhileness, I frame this in kind of two ways. The first is, how much will I learn? And the second is, what's the risk? So you could think about it in terms of kind of risk and reward and sort of a typical framework around how do I gauge what I need to be going after. But for me, it's really important to call out the learning component of this. And the learning component of this is saying, like, how much will I learn as a result of this project? And the reason why that's important is because in the world of software products, in the world of fast-moving, quick developing, really, really kind of ever-changing e-commerce spaces, understanding what changes and what impacts you have on the product is really, really important, right? Because if you don't understand those changes or you don't understand what you're affecting, it's either blind success, right? So you don't understand why you succeeded, or it's blind failure, so you don't understand why you failed. And so that understanding component is just so very fundamental when I think about actually creating product. And I'm going to talk a little bit about Cartrawler because we live in a world of kind of complex things. So as Rory said there, what does Cartrawler do? How do we work? And really, this is somewhat complex because we have kind of two users. So Ryanair is one of our partners that we work with. And we've got the guys that are sitting around the table. So the internal stakeholders of the business that is Ryanair. And then we also have the end users that are Ryanair, right? So we have those guys that are actually plugging into their apps. And we're ultimately thinking about, okay, who are the end users? And then on the flip side of things, what does the business want? So in other words, if you think about that in different terms, we have all the suppliers that we connect to. So suppliers being like the Hertz and the Budgets and the Avises, the car rental companies. And then we build the software that sits in between, and then we work with the guys like Ryanair, Emirates, Norwegian, and they plug into our software, right? So like largely that's kind of how it works out. And in travel, and in travel tech specifically, one of the interesting trends that's somewhat not so interesting is that mobile really didn't take off. So like all the other spaces out there, and I'm sure many of the ones that you're working in where you saw mobile just like shoot up in a really exciting ways many years ago, that kind of didn't happen in travel for a very long time, particularly within travel bookings. It was really curious, and so for a long time we kind of didn't invest in it. We invested in desktop. So just to give you a sense, like desktop was driving 80% of our bookings, tablet a further 10, and mobile was around 10%. So we're kind of going, that's interesting. And that mobile space really hadn't taken off. But we were starting to see trends that were changing. And so we thought, maybe we should actually think about building our capabilities in this area and actually think about what that actually means. We got this really exciting opportunity when Ryanair approached us and said, would you like to be part of our native app? And we're like, oh, that's kind of cool. We've got these guys on the side experimenting with all things native. So maybe we should be thinking about this, or actually, how do we think about that as a potential opportunity? This concept of going native, right, was quite interesting for us because, you know, literally the definition means taking on the traits of things around you or the culture traits of those around you. And that's exactly what we do in our software and how we build our software. So that's kind of how we were thinking about the problem is, right, we need to build something for somebody else and we don't have a lot of experience in that area. So in the world of riskiness and learning, this is kind of how I thought about the problem. On one side, it was about the propensity to learn, and on the other side, it was about the riskiness associated with that decision, right? So if you think about low riskiness or high riskiness and low propensity to learn, you're sort of playing in these two spaces, which is going, you know, what's the point? Like, why would I take risk and not learn anything? That doesn't make a lot of sense. Whereas if you actually move kind of more into the kind of higher or medium levels of propensity to learn, right? Like how much am I going to learn in these spaces? And then you move along the dial of the sort of riskiness associated with those decisions, that's where it starts to get interesting. And for me, this decision very much fell in between solid and ballsy, right? Like I think a lot of these decisions often fall in this space. Like it's never the case really where you get no risk whatsoever and you're going to learn loads, right? Like that just very rarely happens. And so that was really where we sat, right? We're going, we kind of have a native app. We have a few guys sitting there developing this thing, and we've got the world's second largest airline approaching us about being a part of this. That's really exciting, really risky. How are we going to go about actually going after this decision and thinking about it, right? And that's what exciting, right? So what we decided was that very concept that I alluded to at the start, which was we started small. So we said to Ryanair, right, okay, so we're going to build this thing in phases. We're going to create a number of different features associated with this, and we're going to build it at pace. And we're going to work with your guys and try and figure out actually how do we actually develop this app and how do we learn in that process? How do we learn about not only the mobile space, how do we learn about how to develop native apps, and how do we do this in kind of not necessarily the perfect way, right? So when you turn around to some of our engineers at the time, they're going, well, we don't really know the architectural structure, we don't know how we're going to go after these things, it's a really exciting opportunity, but I'm not so sure, right? And then on the flip side of that, we're going, well, how stable is this thing going to be, and like, how are we going to go after these different opportunities? And, you know, the exciting thing about this decision, while it was risky, as I said, that kind of propensity to learn was huge, both in terms of how we learned to develop that capability in the mobile space, but also in terms of how we learned about the mobile space. So mobile is up now for the company as a result of this decision, over 50% year on year, and it's continuing to grow in that space. So because we made that leap, it's like, wow, we're learning loads about the mobile space, we actually developed some of this capability, and we've done so in phases. Now, what's interesting about that is that we haven't done so perfectly, right? So we don't have this like perfect model, and actually one of the big projects that we're investing in at the moment is scaling this out and thinking about actually how do we work back from some of the decisions that we made really quickly to be a part of this space and learn from this space. So it's not all about worthwhileness, but it's also about thinking through things differently. And when I say thinking through things differently, what I mean is two things. One, knowing why you're doing something, and two, knowing when to do something, right? Knowing why to bring things together, and knowing when to bring those things together. So I passed by this shop in Copenhagen called Sneakers and Coffee. And it's not the type of coffee that's here in Amsterdam. It's the actual drink, right? And I passed by the shop and I was thinking, like, this is ingenious, right? Like, sneakers and coffee, like, who thought of that? That's kind of cool. And you're probably thinking, well, like, why sneakers and coffee? And if you think about it, like, coffee these days is something, it's got something of like an exclusive quality, right? You go into these like coffee houses, you get these like handcrafted beans and brews and cups and like this really kind of wonderful experience of drinking these cups of coffee. And then sneakers, well, they're a thing of high fashion, right? Like, I've passed by so many high street photos, so these actually come from Dublin, where I live. And, you know, like the idea that these things are, you know, not just a comfortable, practical purchase, but there's something that people want to wear on their feet, and they want to make, look and feel better. They're actually cool now. So, when we think about sneakers and coffee, it's that sort of unnatural pairing that seems like, well, why do these things work together, and why did this shop decide to pair those things together? Well, the why of it is that, like, when you purchase these things or when you're associating these things, it makes you look and feel better. And the when of it is, it's in this like kind of hip neighborhood in Copenhagen in the appropriate spot at the appropriate time. And in the Cartrawler world, we pair lots of different things. Planes, trains, and automobiles nearly rolls off the tongue. So we're thinking about airlines, we're thinking about cars, we're thinking about trains, we're thinking about lots of different types of content and how it is that you get from A to B. And I would actually say that when we initially thought about these things, we kind of made the mistake of saying they're all the same thing, it's all part of one travel journey, it all makes sense together, let's sell them together, let's think about these things together, how do we build platforms where everything is just available to everybody, because people want it, right? You're trying to get from point A to point B, people want these things, they're important. But actually, if you think about a typical travel journey, a typical purchasing journey, you go to one place to figure out where it is that I want to go, right? So you're usually on like a TripAdvisor or blogs or talking to your friends, figuring out, okay, well, where am I going to go on my holiday? Am I going to go to Copenhagen or am I going to go to New York? Then the next decision that you make is purchasing your flight. So you go on, you purchase your flight, and you're like, right, okay, now I'm going to New York, that's very exciting, and now I'm going to get my hotel. So I need to figure out where I'm going to stay, and once I've got my hotel, then I'll think about anything else later. So restaurants, any of that kind of stuff is going to be a later purchase or a later decision. And the two later components are if the journey is kind of complicated or it's continuous, it's usually car rental. So if you're going to need transport with you throughout your holiday, you're going to be going to multiple different places, you're probably going to be thinking about car rental. Whereas if you're doing like a simple point-to-point journey from the airport to the hotel, you're probably going to go with a transfer or a taxi or that type of transport, right? And the why of these two things is really interesting to me, right? Because the first is, on the car rental side, as I said, it's complex, it's unlimited, it's self-service. Whereas on the transfer side, it's simple, it's limited point-to-point, it's very much about service. They're two different types of decisions, and they're two different types of things that happen at different stages. And that's exactly it. So when do these things happen? You generally think about car rental way in advance of your trip. So it is the last decision that you make when you're booking, generally, right? But it's usually way in advance of your trip. Whereas on the flip side, like, who books a taxi 3 months in advance? Like, it just doesn't happen, right? Like, that's not a behavior that we have. So again, thinking about the why, like, why would I book these things? And then the when of these things is a lot smarter. So as I said before, what we had done initially is we're going, right, we're selling all these things, part of the flight purchase, we're working with our airlines, we're working with all these different travel companies around the world, so they're all going to go as part of one platform. But actually, the real innovation comes when you think about these whys and whens, as I was saying. So what we're experimenting with at the moment is, how innovative is this, right? We're going to actually ping you when we know where your destination airport is, we know where you're going because you booked your flight, and then we're going to ping you at the appropriate time when you're actually thinking about transfer, not 3 months in advance when you're in a complicated booking funnel and you're trying to make all those different purchasing decisions. So really simple things like that. It sounds very simple, but it took us time to get there before we were thinking about those things in the right context and how we actually pair these things. So as I said, whether it be sneakers or coffee, or whether it be trains and transfers and automobiles and flights, knowing the whys and the whens of these things is really important. And then finally, nuanced. It's all about the small things. And I think all too often, particularly when we focus on the big grand ideas and vision, we really lose sight of some of these smaller things and smaller changes that we make to the products that have massive impacts. So I'm going to talk through a few, in my opinion, exciting examples. These are things we've just done over the last couple of months, actually. And one of the things we do is very important to me, and it's something that John Buckley touched on earlier, is that notion of actually being really in touch with your end users, understanding the insight, and really drilling into that insight so that you're solving problems based on that insight. So we do a lot of research, and we look at all the different problem statements and pain points that our users have. And in the car rental industry specifically, one of the big pain points is insurance, right? Like, I even say the word insurance, and immediately like, oh, what's that? What am I signing up for? Like, what's this like fearful kind of thing? And if you think about car rental as like an asset that you're renting, these assets are upwards of 20 grand. So like the notion you could damage this thing, you could, have all sorts of issues on your holiday. It's like intimidating, it's fearful, it's not very sexy, it's not great. But insurance is a fundamental component of how it is that we think about the car rental space, because we want people to have a peaceful holiday. We want them to have a good holiday. And what we found is that lots of different insurance products out there on the market, and largely they're grouped into sort of two categories, and that's around basic and premium insurances. And 53% of our customers didn't understand the differences between these things. Intuitively you're going, well, basic is basic and premium probably means something more, but do you actually understand the context around those things? So I'll break it down for you. The car rental company sells basic insurance, which basically doesn't cover you. It covers you in terms of a lot of the car, but there's this kind of upwards of €3,000 excess charge that you could be paying if you haven't taken out an insurance product. On the premium side of things then, this covers that €3,000 liability charge that you could potentially have and insures you for all that. The complicated bit is that if you damage the car, you have to pay that money still to the car rental company. So you're still paying your €3,000 to the car rental company, and then you can reclaim it back, right? Clear as mud? Exactly. So how do you explain that in a UI that people spend less than 10 seconds reading, right? Like this is the really, really big challenge for us. So when we thought about it, we go, right, okay, well, the first thing we're going to test is a number of different displays that have varying levels of information. So, is more information the right amount of content? Is less information the right amount of content? What types of content are people looking for? Is it about miscarriage, undercarriage, tires? Are these things important? Like, what do people want to know that's included, not included? All these types of things. And as we were coming up and crafting the copy, it was about two things. One was how much copy, and the second was what types of copy, or what types of information are people kind of looking for. And can anyone guess which one of these three? The one on the right? You guessed it, less is more. Who knew? We proved it. So we saw, it was amazing. We'd see these massive variances depending on what type of copy we wrote, depending on what type of information we were presenting. If you just think about that uplift in a business of our size, it was absolutely huge for us, right? And it was just simply removing lines of copy. That's really what it was. Those displays were quite similar. It was just actually drilling it into the right amount of information that people were looking for. The second test is one of my favorites that we've done in the last couple months. And we used something called the nudge principle. So many of you have probably heard about this behavioral economics-wise, but really the idea is that we're not going to tell you that you're fat, right, if you decide to go up the escalator, but we're certainly going to hint at it, right? So we're not going to be direct with you, but we're actually going to nudge you in the right direction. And this actually worked, by the way. No one was taking the escalator anymore, which is just really interesting, right? And so you're going, okay, well, how do we use that to our advantage, knowing that this insurance product is really, really complicated. It's really difficult to consume, but it's really important that people understand what kind of coverage they're getting in this mix. So as I said, one doesn't really cover you, and one actually kind of covers you, right? So we were thinking about these two kind of concepts. We're going how do we explain in a UI that, again, people are spending less than 10 seconds on, what these things actually mean. So we decided to title our insurances differently. So these are the words we tried. So we said, really, if you think about that one cover, it's kind of basic as a non-term. So we're going to call it limited, because it's limited coverage. You're not getting your full coverage. And then we're going to actually go between the words standard and premium, right? So the notion being that, do you, as a user, expect a certain level of cover when you're going to purchase an insurance product? Or do you feel like you want to pay a premium for that insurance? Like, as in, do you want the 5-star hotel or do you want the 3-star hotel? Like, how do these things operate in your mind, and how do you actually evaluate what that means in terms of insurance? Two very similar displays, right? Like, words of copy that changed. Limited, standard, limited, and premium. Anyone want to wager a guess which one won? Left? Any other lefts? Okay, any rights? Good man. So we saw a -6 drop between the words limited and standard. And you're going, what? Like, we just explained that this is the coverage that you should be expecting to get. Like, I don't understand. Like, how did this even happen? And it's just 2 words of copy, which again is that further impact piece. And then when we put this version live, plus 11%. Like, how did that happen? Words, oh copy, right? Like, I'm going, I just still don't understand how these tiny changes can have such massive impacts. And these are the things that are so important, right? When you're thinking about product, it's not about changing the entire flow or making everything like the most simplest thing that you've ever seen in your life and like the better UX and all these kinds of things. Sometimes it is, but lots of times it's these tiny things that are drilled into, as I was saying, those really kind of strong user insights as to how we solve these problems for our users, right? So I'll share another one with you just before I go. So we know, again from our research, that 85% of our customers travel with a companion. And that sounds pretty reasonable. You're going, okay, well, you've got some business users in there, and then you've got kind of like your kind of leisure users, and most people go to places with other people. Like, this is something that happens in travel, so that makes sense. And one of the things we thought about in this space is going, okay, well, if people are going with people, you know, places, and there's lots of different purchases happening in a booking funnel, the people that are researching or the people that are purchasing aren't necessarily the decision makers, right? So is it the, you know, the husband or the wife or the friend or whomever it happens to be that's actually going to be the person that's making that decision? So this concept of like, how do we share content so that we enable these decisions to happen a little bit more easily for our users is something that we've really been thinking about quite a bit, right? And we're going, okay, so we had this old mobile web flow and display. As I said, we were working on our mobile. And we had this concept called email quote, as you can see down here at the bottom in gray, lovely color. We didn't focus on mobile. And then we moved to this kind of new flow, and we were thinking, right, okay, so we're gonna make this thing really prominent. We're gonna put the share icon up at the top. We're gonna make this like feature totally something that people can do and they can interact with, they can email, they can SMS. It's gonna be great. We're gonna add all this prominence to our share display. And guess what happened? Oh, ta-da. So there's the share icon, right? And we saw a massive drop. So like our share metrics just plummeted. And we're going, what? Like, we just enabled sharing and in a really powerful way. And like before we had this ugly like CTA that was gray and nearly looked like it was inactive. How did our share metrics drop? Like, how did they plummet? And then it was more prominent. Like, what's going on? And this is what we found. First of all, the share icon is not something that is well recognized and widely recognized. So if you ever notice in terms of UIs, what you see is the word share paired with that icon, right? And so like it actually needs to be paired with a word. So that was the first insight that we had. But the other insight that we had was this kind of typical behavior in travel, which is that people don't think of sharing content, they think of saving content to share it, right? So if you go on the booking.coms, you go on the, hotels.com, you go on all these different sites, right? And you think about actually how do people think about these things. Hearts are a really prominent feature. Airbnb, like all of them have hearts, and it's this notion of kind of saving content before you share content. So we took it too far. We went, one step further than our users were willing to go in terms of what they understood, and that's what ended up happening. So, as I said, for me, it's about three things. One is, how do you gauge what's worthwhile? And that's all about that propensity to learn versus your risk. Two is, what's innovative? How are you thinking about the whys and whens of what you're pairing in terms of how you're bringing these things together? And the final piece is, how am I thinking about the tiny things? How am I thinking about those small things that actually have massive impacts on the product? It's not just about those big visions or those ideas. So think big to fuel the great ideas. but start small to ensure you get there and win. Thank you.